want to just review what we've done up until now. We've seen several of the Achronim who undertake the Sheila of intellectual property. Is it permitted or is it not permitted to take someone else's Chidushei Torah, which is the more common issue that is at hand, and to reprint it without getting permission from the owner of that property, whether it's the author himself or whether it's the heirs of that author? And we had seen that there seems to be a divide amongst the poskim in that area. There are some poskim, like we saw from the Shaul Umeshiv, who says that it's clear that this is a violation of the law of Hasagas Gavul, of encroachment, and therefore you don't have a right to take someone's intellectual property, even if they don't forewarn in the opening of the Sefer. Even if they don't tell you, copyright reserved, all rights reserved, and things like that. But the very fact that a person has created an object of value, and really the ramifications are, even when the person who's printing the Chidushei Torah has already made all his money back and has made a sizable profit off of selling of his Sisfarim, but there's continued earning potential, we still say that a person owns his intellectual property. We saw another school of Achronim, the Beis Yitzchak and Rav Bennett also, who are of the opinion, Rav Mordechai Bennett, who are of the opinion that no, perhaps you could argue that intellectual property is too ethereal. It's one thing to say, and this seems to be the consensus of the poskim who are on the side of being makel, it's one thing to say that if a person has already invested money into the publishing of a sefer, that we could prevent another person from competing, because there you're actually causing monetary loss. But let's say a person has already invested and recouped his investment through the selling of his Sfarim, and now it's just a question of wanting to be able to, either a generation later or several years later, to be able to come back and want to republish the Sefer, perhaps repackage it, publish it with other commentaries and so forth. In that situation, the poskim had said that this school of poskim had said that there is no isser of hasagas gavul, that when it comes to ethereal intellectual property, there's no such thing as encroachment. Okay, and the only thing that they did point to, however, is another issue, which is dina de malchus dina. And so when the law of the land tells you that you are in violation of copyright, even if halacha does not recognize the copyright, you still are not allowed to do it. And we saw a couple of explanations. We really saw two possible explanations as to why, normally when there's a clash between dina de malchusa dina and halacha, when it comes to monetary law, we normally say that halacha prevails. But why do we therefore say over here that a person who wishes to copy someone else's intellectual property has to obey dina de malchusa? Why don't we say, no, it's a free market according to halacha? So we saw two answers. One answer we saw is that there's a difference between loss of money and losing out on potential profit. When we say that halacha trumps dina de malchusa is only when, by abiding by dina de malchusa, you're causing a Jew a financial loss. But if abiding by dina de malchusa does not cause a Jew financial loss, but it simply deprives him of financial gain, then we say that dina de malchusa prevails over halacha. Another answer that we saw, which to me is like my head is still spinning from the ramifications of this idea, we saw this from Rav Shimon Sofer in his Sefer Hisorus Tshuva. He is of the opinion that when there's a clash between dina de malchusa and halacha in financial issues, when do we say that dina de malchusa prevails over halacha? When dina de malchusa has yosher on its side. When there's yosher in concert with dina de malchusa, then dina de malchusa trumps halacha. Now, someone asked me after the shiur, how can you tell me that halacha is not on the side of yosher? That halacha is not on the side of propriety, of uprightness. That's what yosher means. And so I tried to explain as best as I could. There are situations where the halacha does not require a person to act in the highest standard of ethics, but it requires him to act with a modicum of ethics. In other words, the halacha was never designed to make sure we're all tzaddikim. The halacha was designed to make sure that we're all beinanim, that we're all good people, not excellent people. Let's say the law of the land advances to a point where the law of the land says, in this particular area, we demand excellence of people, right? Because that's the standards when it comes to people's rights to their own intellectual property, or people's rights to privacy, or it could be anything. But sometimes the law of the land may actually surpass halacha in what we deem to be upright and good and proper and ehrlich, right? So then we would say that Dina de Malchusa would actually trump halacha in a situation where halacha would say that you're allowed to exploit this item for personal gain, and Dina de Malchusa would say that you're not allowed to. So that's where we left up to. That's where we're up to at this point. The reason why I believe that part 3 is very relevant to us Bizman Hazeh, and I'm actually going to be quoting, as I've done in the past weeks, from a very important sefer called Emek HaMishpat. Emek HaMishpat was published about 10 years ago. It was published by a very chashuv, a Talmud Chacham in Kiryat Sanz in Netanya by the name of Rav Avraham Yaakov Kohen. And I think he lives in the Kloisenberger community, because I received the sefer from the Kloisenberger Rebbe when he visited Los Angeles a few years ago. Or maybe actually I went to Kiryat Sanz and he gave it to us then. I don't remember. It was a group of rabbis we went. But the point is that this sefer, it's a thick sefer all about intellectual property. All about the laws of intellectual property. I mean, and he goes through Sugya by Sugya, page by page. And he devotes a special section, not just to intellectual property, but he argues that you can actually make a division within intellectual property. And I'm not sure whether secular law recognizes or acknowledges this separation or not. He says there's intellectual property that is completely ethereal. It's the world of ideas. It's the realm of ideas, right? I have an idea. I'm a philosopher. So I write down my philosophical thoughts on paper, or I type them out on the computer and I publish them. That's one form of intellectual property. But there's another form of intellectual property which is more grounded in the physical world. And that's in the realm of art, where I produce something that's artistic either visually or auditorily. Right. Or what were you going to say?
What you said.
Orally, but A-U-R-A-L-L-Y, right? Or, having to do with either the visual arts or the oral arts, or I guess the music, right? Or a SHIUR, or something like that. You could argue that even if intellectual property laws do not apply to things that are completely not rooted in anything physical, like just the realm of ideas, you might be able to make the argument that things that are visual or things that are auditory, those things may be more substantive, such that even if you would argue that there is no rights of intellectual property in halacha for ideas, there may be intellectual property rights when it comes to art that is displayed in the world. So this would apply to photography, it would apply to painting, it would apply to sculpture, it would apply to, if a person, let's say, has drawn a beautiful painting, and he wants to print a limited number of prints or lithographs. Would it be permitted for me to counterfeit the other prints of my own and sell them, assuming that the artist has already sold off all of the original prints? Could I go ahead, since I'm not causing him a loss of money, I'm only depriving him of future profits, would I be allowed to do that? So that's the reason why in the Sefer Emek HaMishpat, he equivocates and discusses this idea. And he presents us with a very interesting, the way he presents it is a machlokes among Achronim in the 19th century. And this time the machlokes is between Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and the Rogatchover, and we're going to discuss that tonight. The shaila that the Rogatchover has, is it permitted to take a person's photograph without their permission? Is it permitted to take a person's photograph without their permission? Or if I want to take a photo of you, al pi halacha, do I have to get your rishus first? That's the shayla.
That's becoming more prevalent. You go on walking tours and they say, don't take a picture generally because you could capture someone else's photo. Don't do that without their permission. I never heard that before.
Correct. And in the world of television and film, if you need to get a person's explicit permission to broadcast them on TV, if they get caught in the, or let's say a person is wearing a shirt with a logo of a company. Sometimes you'll see on these reality TV shows, not that I watch that chazarai, but sometimes you'll see on the reality TV shows, they'll either blur out the person's face or they'll blur out the person's t-shirt because it's got some kind of trademark on the shirt. Okay, so this is in the realm of art, it's in the realm of visual and auditory as well. So, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld says, his tshuva is a very short tshuva. There's a Shiloh's Tshuva sefer called Salmat Chaim. And you know that Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, he was born in 1849 in Slovakia. He studied under the Ksav Sofer in Pressburg. And in 1873 he made Aliyah and he became the Rav of the old Yishuv in Yerushalayim until his death in 1932. And he founded the Eda Charedis in Yerushalayim. So we know that so many stories about Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld in the old Yishuv of Yerushalayim. But here's the shaila. Source number one: Imuter litzalem adam b'li reshuso. Nistapakti begoy shechatav tmunat partzufo shel echad al yedei mechona hamiyuchedet lazeh shelo b'yediato. He says, I'm not sure about the following situation. This is the person asking the question. A Gentile takes the photograph of a person using a certain kind of machine. Well, that's what we call a camera today, right? And says, remember, I mean, he's writing this probably at the end of the 19th century. You know, when you had to hold up this thing and it went boom, you know, and they took your picture. You had to stand there for an hour, right? So he takes a picture of a guy on the street, and shelo b'yediato, without his knowledge. What would the Jewish law say about this? The halah eno maziko ve'eno machasro klum. On the one hand, you could say that the photographer is not causing any loss. I'm not harming you in any way. It would be say zen nen v'zelo chaser, like I'm benefiting from your image and you don't lose anything by it. Ulai eno yochol limchot bi'ado afilu lechatchila. Maybe even lechatchila, you can't stop a person from taking your photograph. He says, what are you going to do about the Kabbalistic concern that's brought down in Pischei Tshuva and Yoredeya that says that a person should not have his likeness duplicated? Right? I have to tell you, this is still practiced today. I don't know if you have any Hasidic relatives. I have a whole part of my family is Satmar. And I know that there's a tremendous aversion. By the way, if you make a Satmar Chasana, you can save money on the photographer, on the videographer. No one wants pictures, right? So, all right, it's considered to be because there's this idea that there's a Ruach Tumah that can rest upon a person's image, a person's likeness. But he says, no, that's not a good argument, says Rabbi Yosef Chaim. Hainu ala Tmuna hamitzuyeret. That's on an artist's rendering. But on a photograph, I don't know how he knows this. I have no idea how he knows this. It could be because, maybe this would make a very good another shiur for another time. When do we say that a Ruach Tumah rests on a person's likeness and when does it not? But Rabbi Yosef Chaim says that it only rests on a person's, an artist's rendering, but on a photograph there is no Ruach Tumah. So he says, and therefore maybe a photograph doesn't do anything harmful to the person who bears that image. On the other hand, you might be able to argue, like the Gemara says, there's a Mishnah that talks about a guy who is a socher. A socher is a renter. He rents your cow, okay, and then he goes and he lends the cow to a friend. Now, when you're a renter, you only have one level of liability. When you're a shoyel, you have a higher level of liability. So let's say the animal dies, and it's a total onus. I, as the socher, am pater, but my friend who I lent it to is chayiv. So the Mishnah says, there's one opinion that says that, hey, I just made a quick buck. I rented someone's cow, I paid him the rental fee, so therefore I'm not liable for certain accidents. But when I lend it to my friend, he becomes liable for those accidental deaths, and therefore he's got to pay me. But Rabbi Yossi in the Mishnah says that's ridiculous. How can you make a profit off of your friend's property? And therefore, maybe you could argue that this would be the same thing. How is it permitted for me, as the photographer, to enterprise off of someone else's likeness if it's their punim, right? That's the counter argument, right?
What if there's no commercial gain? He just takes it for himself.
Okay, so that would be another issue, right? But I think that the question that he's asking is there are multiple parts to this question. Number one, can the person whose picture is being taken object? Number two, is the photographer allowed to be able to take an object which is now of value? I mean, if you're taking a photo in the 19th century, there's obviously the objective is you're going to try to make some money off of it, because otherwise no one's going to invest that kind of money in taking a... People didn't take photos for a hobby back then, right? He says, "Gam nehadim atzinu." He says, but let's look at it another way. He says, we have a halacha in Yoredeya that says that mi shetziva shelo yaspiduhu shomin lo. That if a person before he dies gives a charge and he says, I don't want any hesped at my levaya. I don't want you to say anything nice about me. I just want to put me in the ground and be done with it. So the halacha is that you're obligated to listen to the person and respect their wishes. So skip the brackets. He says, Mashma lichora da adam yachol le'esor al chaveiro shelo yasa eza esek imo shelo biyidi aso neged ritzono. From that standpoint, it sounds like that you can actually demand that a person not have anything to do with something that is related to your life or death. And therefore it sounds like from there that just like I could demand that you don't say a hesped at my levaya, I don't want you to take my likeness in a photograph. It's my body, it's my face, and I don't want you to have any part of it. He says, Gam be'inyan zenen v'zelo chaser kasvu ataysus tezadavka b'di'evet ein tzarich lahalos sachar. Did I skip a line? Oh no, I'm sorry. He says, and even if you're going to argue the principle of zen and v'zelo chaser, like there's no skin off of your nose, it's nothing off of your back if I take your likeness. What have I taken anything from you? That may be an argument b'di'evet if I already took the photograph, but lechatchila, even if I don't lose anything by you taking my likeness. Tosfos says you have a right to protest, even in the case of zen and v'zelo chaser. So this is all part of the shaila. So this is the person who's asking the shaila, and now comes the tshuva from Yosef Chaim. It's unusual. Usually the tshuva is much longer than the shaila. Here the tshuva is a one-liner. So what's the tshuva? Ein zev b'paraso shel chaveiro kim al yedei ma'asei atzmo. So he says, first of all, the analogy to making money off of your friend's cow is not apt. He says, because that's only when it's actually the handiwork of your friend. Something that is of monetary value of your friend, I believe he's saying, only there do we say that you're not allowed to enterprise off of someone else's financial property, but off of someone's likeness, there's no problem. Ve'im yitzayiro midato v'chiyachol le'esor alav, he says, and let's say the photographer gets permission from you. You think that afterwards you're going to be able to prevent him from using it? That, of course, you can't. Ein adam oser davar she'eno b'rishuso ela shel chavero. There's a little bit of a word missing there, and when it's quoted in other svarim, they add another word in there. A person cannot forbid or prohibit from someone else to use something that is not in his domain anymore. My likeness is not in my domain. It's actually in the public domain. Every time I walk outside, my likeness is in the public domain. And therefore, if you take a photograph of me, says Rabbi Yosef Chaim, it's not mine anymore. That is not my property anymore, and therefore it's permitted for you to use my face in your photography. And I can't stop it. That's Azoy Paskin, Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. So the Emek HaMishpat, Rav Cohen says that if you look at the footnotes that are printed in the Sefer Salmas Chaim, which actually is also part of the Bar Ilan CD-ROM, you will notice that the people who put together the Yorshim of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld had very extensive notes to the tshuva. And in one of the footnotes, they quote from the Tzofnas Paneach, the Rogatchover, who was also a contemporary, he's living at around the same time. He was a Gaon Atzum. And he, a lot of times when he would write a tshuva, you would need to know Shas and Poskim to understand what the Rogatchover was saying. The reason is because he would write very, very terse comments, and he would say, I in this, and I in that, and I in this, and then B'tzarchiyim. It wasn't really even a tshuva, it was just like, look at all these places. Rabbi Kiva does that also a lot of times, where you're left a little bit clueless sometimes. What does he really mean to tell me? So the Emek HaMishpah tries to explain the Rogatchover, but if you take a look at footnote number 2, he says the tshuva of the Rogatchover as far as the shaila is different. He says, take a look at a number of sources. He wants you to first take a look at Bava Metzia Daf Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, Asr La'adam, etc. Okay, so what is this talking about? That's in source number 2. In source number 2, Rabbi Yochanan says that there are 3 places that Rabbi Yehuda taught us that a person is not allowed to benefit from the monetary items that belong to his friend. So one of those things is that Hanosein Tzemer Letzava Litzbolo Adom Utzva'o Shachor Shachor Tzva'o Adom. That let's say I take raw wool and I hire a dyer, a guy who dyes. Not a guy who dies, a guy who dies, right? And I hire him to dye, is that what they call a dyer? I don't know. I hire him to dye my wool, and he dyes it the wrong color. Instead of dyeing it red, he dyes it black or vice versa. And the halacha is, what do I owe him? Do I owe him anything? So here Rabbi Yehuda says, you give him the less of the 2 values, either his expenses or the increase in value of the raw wool to now being dyed wool. Right? In other words, the dyer, because he made the error, has the disadvantage, but you have to pay him something. Either the cost of the dye, or you have to pay him the value, the increase in value of the wool, whichever one is less. Okay? And the reason is because Ein Adam, Asr La'adam Sheyehene Mimamon Chaver, because you're not allowed to benefit from someone else's property. The Rogatchover points to this, at least it seems that he's pointing, this is what Rav Cohen says, is that he's trying to indicate that even when you're not taking anything of value from a person, but it's still their property, it's still lechatchila going to be asr. In other words, here the Gemara is talking about b'di'evet. If the guy delivers to you the wrong color wood, what is the restitution that you have to make to him post facto? But what you do see also, you can infer from this, is that even pre-facto, the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, doesn't want you to exploit someone else's efforts, someone else's hard work. And so therefore you see that even though my punim may not, I didn't work very hard to create my punim, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it, but the fact that it belongs to me and it's something that Hashem doesn't want, Rabbi Yehuda says, no one should benefit from someone else's property. This, my punim is my property, and therefore the Rogatchover says this points to this idea, Asr la'adam sheyehene mimamon chavero. Don't benefit from someone else's property. What's the other Gemara? And that would indicate, by the way, that you're not allowed to take someone's photograph without their permission. Another thing he points to, he says, I'm just continuing in this footnote on the bottom. Ayin Bava Metzia Daf Lamed Amid Aleph. And again, he doesn't tell us what it's about. So source number 4. If you take a look, actually source number 3, there's a Mishnah, which talks about the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, of returning lost objects. Now, what if you find something that, if you don't care for it in the interim, it could get damaged? So the Mishnah tells us that if matzah ksus, if you find a garment in the street and you want to care for it properly, mina'ara echas l'shloshim yom, you have to shake it out once every 30 days. V'shotcha litzarcha avalo lichvodo, and you're allowed to spread it out, let's say on a canopy or something like that, to let it dry or to let it get fresh air, but not for your own honor. not for your own honor. You can't do that. So what does that mean, do it for your own honor? So the Gemara on Daf Lamed of that same Gemara really tells us that, let's say you find this amazingly expensive tapestry or curtain or blanket, and it's an exquisitely precious weave of very expensive fabric, and it's done like a Persian carpet or something like that. So you might say, well, I got to spread it out because to air it out and shake off the dust. But what if you do it in a conspicuous place in the front of your house so that everyone can see, hey, look, this, Yankel has this expensive Persian carpet. So that's what the Mishnah is really saying. The Gemara explains that's what the Mishnah really means. That if it's for the sake of the carpet, right, then it's okay. But if you're doing it in order to gain a sense of kavod from it, so that everyone should think that you're an usher, so that maybe they'll extend you credit and so forth, so then it's not permitted. Number two, so you see again an example of you're not causing a person any financial loss by doing this. You're only benefiting from the aesthetics that another person owns. You're benefiting from an imagery that other person owns. Because also, after all, what are you doing? You're displaying this person's beautiful carpet so that people will think that you're an usher, right? So that's a similar concept of, don't use my images, don't use my art in order to get personal gain from it. So the Rogatchover says that's another argument or another analogy, another analogous Gemara that would point to why you shouldn't be able to take someone else's photograph. And then he quotes from Uvitosefta Bava Mitzia Perek Dalet Halacha Aleph Gabe Lehisnos Debemoshel Hektish Aser. And this is a Tosefta. And this is in source number 6. Maskir Adam Ma'osav L'Shulchane Lehispos Lehisnos Bahen Ulehislame Bahen Ulehisatir Bahen V'imasa King Behektish Harei. That what you're allowed to do is you're allowed to rent money to a money changer. Let's say a money changer wants to show everyone that he's got a very viable business. If you want to be able to show everyone that you're a viable businessman as a money changer, you got to show that your coffers are full. Let's say the guy is just getting started. So he says to the bank, he says, I'll rent from you cash so that I can display it in my display so that people will come to me. So you're allowed to do that, and that's true even if, now here, v'im'asa came behektish harei, but if you do that with hektish, you're liable for me'ilah. So there is a certain benefit that you're getting from this, even though it's only image, right? Even though the only benefit you're getting is the benefit of imagery, it's still a substantive benefit, to the point where if you took something that was hektish and used it to gain benefit from by just through displaying it, so then you would be liable for me'ilah. Another example. Final example that the Rogatchover gives is Nedarim Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. And that's over there, the Gemara Nedarim says, what if you took a vow not to benefit from someone else's property? The question is, are you allowed to use his ring, le'ra'os bo, in order to be seen in public by that person's ring? With that person's ring. In other words, let's say you know a guy who was in the Super Bowl, and he's got a what do they call that ring?
Super Bowl ring.
Super Bowl ring. Okay, thank you. That's what you hear. So let's say a guy has a Super Bowl ring, and you want to impress your friends and go to a party one day with a Super Bowl ring. Okay, it's got no value other than the prestige that you will get by displaying the Super Bowl ring. So the Gemara equivocates whether or not, if you've taken a vow of hana'ah from the person, whether that's permitted or not. And the Gemara seems to conclude, or at least there's one side of the Gemara that seems to conclude that it's usher because that's called a tangible benefit. So once again, the Rogatchover points to all of these Gemaras and comes out with the conclusion, this is really what the Eimek HaMishpat is really concludes, is that the Rogatchover completely disagrees with Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rabbi Yosef Chaim says there's no tangible benefit from taking a likeness of your punim. Here we see that images that belong to other people really do offer tangible benefit, and therefore it's usher without their permission, or without offering them some kind of remuneration. Yes?
Isn't it true that a benefit is not the same as taking a piece of property? If you take someone's property, you have ownership of the object plus a benefit. In the other case, you just have a benefit.
Well, that's true, but when it comes to intellectual property, the law, we don't really distinguish. If you have intellectual property, you've written a book, and I simply copy what you've written, I haven't taken your property in a sense, because you still have it, but I've benefited from your property.
So you're taking the words.
Well, I'm taking them, but you still own it. It's not like land. If I take your land, then you are out of land, and I've taken it from you. But when I take something that is transferable and you still retain the original, so I don't know if that's the distinction that you're drawing, but that's the benefit that we're talking about.
Not quite, because under secular law, anyone who writes a work of art, a song or a poem or a novel, for a certain number of years has copyright on it.
Precisely.
But a benefit is not the same as a piece of property.
Well, in secular law, it is identified as intellectual property, and that's why secular law would say that if you take that song and you sell it for yourself without paying royalties to the composer or to the performer, then you're in violation of intellectual property law, not in violation of benefiting law.
But an image is not.
So an image. So we want to argue that an image would be under the same rubric. Now, based upon this, the Emek HaMishpat argues that the same thing would apply by auditory benefits as well. It shouldn't just apply by visual benefits. We should say by extension it should apply to auditory benefits as well. And therefore you could argue that this is again a machlokas haposkim. And again, this is now very, very important. This is what I want to go on page 9, source number 9. Assuming that you're not causing a financial loss to the artist, but you're only depriving the artist of future financial gain, this would be the machlokas as to whether either his likeness, his art, his photography, or his music would fall under the rubric of hasagas gavul, like taking someone's likeness that belongs to them, or would it, and it would be asur, or could you argue like Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, that once it's out there in the public, no one really, it's not tangible enough to be able to argue that it belongs to anyone. So let's take a look, and we just have 3 columns. Like I said, the sefer is this thick, without exaggeration. Let's just look at a few ideas that he has to say. This is from page Tafresh Lamed Test and Tafresh Mem, and the sefer Emek HaMishpat. So Cohen writes as follows: Od echas atzayin shelanias daiti borer kishemesh l'kulei alma. He says, one thing I need to point out is that it's clear to me that shekol tziyur shetziyir o tmuna shetzilem o mar'eh she'itzev mitoch matara li'itparnes mikach v'limkor et tziyurav u'tmunotav. He says, if a person produces a piece of art or photography or any kind of intellectual property that has aesthetic quality to it, and he did it at the outset with the intention to make money off of it, to sell it, azai asur la'adam acher litzalmam u'l'shachpelem b'chdei l'mochram. Then surely in that situation it would be asur for another party to copy that intellectual property for the sake of enterprising off of it himself. V'hama'atik u'mocher over bozeh al isur hasagas gavul. And there, everyone would agree. Even Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, right, would agree that the person is in violation of hasagas gavul. V'gam mitzad haminag v'takanos bali umnas asur lasos zos l'chamoshin isbar ba'orech le'el. Even according to those opinions who say that there's no hasagas gavul on intellectual property, but remember we saw a tshuva going back a couple of weeks from the Shol Umeshiv, and he wanted to argue, I think it was from the Beis Yitzchak as well, that if you're working in an industry where there's already an understanding among all the people in the industry that whenever they want to produce a particular item of intellectual property, that the other parties, other people don't have a right to copy it, like in the publishing business. So then clearly in that situation also, even if you were to argue that there's no technical hasagas gavul, but it's because it's already, there's consensus in the community of publishers. The publishing community has already arrived at that consensus anyway, so no one can sort of be a maverick and say, I'm going to publish intellectual property on my own, and will not take into consideration the standards that have already been set by the industry. So therefore, he says that from that standpoint, also it'll be asur. He says, in a later chapter, I'm going to point out that not every image falls under intellectual property that you can prohibit someone from taking it. And he goes into a discussion of, let's say I take a picture of the Grand Canyon that you can find everywhere, right? It's got to be something unique that makes it special and marketable. You can't say that any picture that I take, a blurry picture of the beach or whatever it is, you can't take it from me. So there are limitations to this. Nevertheless, he says, "V'kol shekain shetzilum tumuna lo havi begeder yitzira mochit." He says, and therefore, let's say copying a picture may not always be in the category of intellectual property. Mikol makom sof kol sof ze barur shelitzayir v'lamitzaleim latzayar v'lamitzaleim yesh zuchut rishonim limkor et hadavar shetarach be'amal alav. But clearly the artist or the photographer has first rights of trying to make money off of that intellectual property. And so therefore, no one, if a person has already made it clear, either through his intentions or through his verbiage or a public announcement, that he plans to try and sell this intellectual property and make money off of it, like when a person does a professional recording or when a person produces a piece of artwork or does professional photography. So then it's clear that no one else would have a right to be able to try and enterprise off of it by copying it. Delo gara midagim she'amal v'tarach l'lochdam. He says this is no different if a person, let's say a person caught a bunch of fish from a public lake, but he worked hard to catch them. You can't say, well, you caught it from a place of hefker, so I can now take it. No, he worked hard, even if he didn't make a kinyan on it yet. Nevertheless, the fact that he exerted effort to acquire this and to produce it makes it a geneva if you take it away from him. O sefer kadmon shehotzi laor shebaseh bevadai ein lo bailus ubevadai she'ein ze begeder yitziras mocho sharei lo hu yatzaras achibor. Another example of this would be, let's say it's not my intellectual property. Let's say I have gotten a hold of an old manuscript which I simply plan to reproduce. But nevertheless, mikol makom asur la'acher litzalmo lahatfiso, it's still going to be asur for someone else to sort of try and take it after I've published it, to be able to copy it. And we've explained this all very carefully before. He says, "V'hu adin shekulam yodu she'adam sheshama zemer o miratzeh v'hiklitam." He says the same thing will be true, that everyone will agree that if a person hears a nice song or he hears a nice lecture on a tape or on a CD, asur lo l'shachpel klitot aklatot bekamuyot mischariot u'lemochram, then clearly it's going to be asur for the person who hears it to try and make duplicates, bootlegs, of what we call it, a bootleg copy of this for the intention to sell. This is what goes on in China all the time. I had a guy who thought he was presenting me with a lovely gift. He went down to Chinatown, which we have here, nice Chinatown in Toronto. I've never been, but I hear it's a beautiful place to visit and buy tchotchkelech. And he brings me a film that he thought I would be interested in seeing that's still in theaters, and it's on DVD. And I said, so-and-so, my friend, I said, this is a bootleg. I'm not going to watch this. I'm not going to watch a bootleg movie. He says, how do you know it's a bootleg? I said, I've been around long enough to know what is a bootleg, okay? You know that it's not in the original packaging. You can tell when something's a bootleg. He says, so therefore, to exploit someone else's intellectual property where the film was produced for the purpose of making money. It's different from taking someone's photograph, where you could argue, okay, maybe the guy took the photograph without the intention of using it for financial gain. Guy just happened to be at the beach, and or he happened to be standing in front of a tornado, and he took a picture of a tornado, and he posted it on his Facebook page. And now I want to go and I want to make it part of a collage of the great tornadoes of the 21st century, and I want to publish it into a book. So maybe there you could argue. But he says, but if it's clear that the person took the photograph to begin with for the purpose of selling it and making money off of it, then for sure it's going to be usher.
Rabbi, so here he's talking about making copies to sell.
Yeah.
But if you make a copy to have a backup, let's say, of a
right, that's called fair use law. The government in almost all countries recognizes what's called fair use law. To make a backup copy for yourself is not what we're talking about over here, because your objective is not to sell it. But let's see how he goes on further.
Yeah. To make a copy, just give to a friend. You say, look, I heard a great Torah. Here's the copy. You don't sell it to him.
Well, it depends, because a matana, in many instances, is the same thing as a mecher. It depends if it's an object of value. Let's say, let's not talk about a Dvar Torah. That's too lofty for me. Let's talk about an album. Let's talk about a movie, right? So I bootleg a film that I just bought. I bought a film at Walmart, and now instead of my friend having to buy the same film, I make a bootleg copy of it. So he says, that's a problem. To lend him the film, that's no problem. Just like I can lend a sefer to my friend, I can lend him a CD. But to make a copy of it, to reproduce it in that way, is taking imagery that has been produced for the purpose, and aesthetic art that has been produced for the purpose of making money, duplicating it, replicating it for the purpose of, even if it's not for sale, even if it's for a matana, there's tovas hana that I get from that matana, like we've talked about many times before, and that's going to be a problem as well. He says, so therefore he says, Im hazemer o hameratzem mitnagdim mishum shirotzim limkor et klatotehem be'atzmam u'laharviach. He says, clearly, if the songwriter, the composer, or the producer of the film, or whatever or the lecture, whatever we're talking about, objects because they want to be able to make money off of their intellectual property, then how can anyone go ahead and bootleg it? Or they sold. The composer can sometimes sell his music to a record company, and the record company is then out of their investment. Everyone agrees that for music, the first right belongs to the composer to be able to sell his property. V'zot gam midin hasagat gvul, and therefore there's clear hasagas gvul, v'gam mitakanas bali umnos ve'aminog, and also because that's the industry standard, like we've explained. Uv'chutz la'aretz gam midina de malchus chemoshen isbar heitev la'el ayin shama. We also explained that there's an issue of dina de malchus dina, at least outside of Eretz Yisrael, and perhaps in Eretz Yisrael as well. We talked about that if you hold that taking someone's intellectual property is a violation only of dina de malchus dina, then one of the nafkaminas might be that it doesn't apply in Eretz Yisrael. Are they dancing now?
Yeah.
Okay, so the rest is commentary, but I just want to make it very, very clear that bizmanenu, illegal downloads, where you're downloading someone else's intellectual property and you're not paying for it, it's very difficult to make the argument that just because I didn't upload it and someone else uploaded it and now becomes part of the public domain, then it's okay for me to take it. Because even though you're not taking it for to be able to make money off of it, but you're certainly causing someone else a financial loss. I just want to mention this last thing, and we'll all go upstairs. There was a Maisa. There was recently, our shul has this day of a craft sale day, which is organized by ladies in the sisterhood, which is a beautiful thing. You get to go to different booths and buy things that you never thought you needed, right? And you buy them, right? And so there was one booth, one guy was selling, it's a certain device, electronic device, which what it'll do is that you search, it's a piece of software with hardware, you attach it to your TV, and you search for a particular movie that you're looking for. And it will search through the web, it will find a safe downloadable site for you, and it already creates several steps of distance from you and the bootlegger. And this was what this device that this person was selling. And I said to him, I'm not so sure that we should be showcasing this in our synagogue. I have a real problem with this. He says, well, it's not illegal. I mean, the person who uploaded it did something illegal. It's not illegal to just find it on the web. It now becomes part of the public domain. I said, I'm not so sure. He said, well, maybe you're right. Maybe it's a gray area. So we agreed to disagree. I think it's pretty clear cut that to download intellectual property that is already, it's clearly been commercialized, and tremendous amounts of money, millions upon millions of dollars have been invested. You can't say, well, I'll just stick it to the man, it's some nebulous company. These are people. You've got people who are the producers, you've got people who are the directors, the actors, the people who are the guys who are holding the cameras and the sets and designing the sets. Some people working only for minimum wage. These people are all entitled to make their parnasa. And the people that are working in the studio and recording the music and all of these other things. So the person has to be very, very careful about all of these issues. And we'll daya, l'chakima, the remiza, the rest is you can infer on your own. Thank you.